Jeff Beck believed perfection was everything. Every note had to be exact. Every bend had to be precise. Every phrase had to be flawless. Then Jimi Hendrix played for 3 minutes and showed Beck that perfection might be the enemy of truth. Abbey Road Studios, Studio 2. March in 1968. The same room where the Beatles had revolutionized popular music was about to witness another kind of revolution. A quieter one. More personal. The studio felt heavy that evening. Outside, London was in the grip of a particularly cold March. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the lingering ghost of 1,000 recording sessions. The room's famous acoustics seemed to hold the memory of every note ever played within these walls, from Sgt. Pepper's to Revolver. Tonight, they would hold something different. Jeff Beck was in the middle of recording what would become Truth, his first solo album after leaving the Yardbirds. At 24, he was already considered one of Britain's most technically gifted guitarists. While Eric Clapton got the blues purist respect and Jimmy Page was building his reputation with session work, Beck was known as the technician, the one who could play anything perfectly every time. His approach to guitar was almost mathematical. Beck would arrive at sessions with detailed charts, each note mapped out like an architectural blueprint. He practiced scales for hours, not to build speed, but to eliminate any possibility of error. His solos weren't emotional outbursts. They were precisely crafted statements, every phrase calculated for maximum technical impact. He'd arrive at sessions with his parts worked out to the smallest detail, every note mapped, every phrase rehearsed until it was mechanical perfection. His solos weren't spontaneous expressions. They were carefully crafted compositions that happened to be played on guitar. Beck's guitar case contained more than just his instrument. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, detailed charts showing finger positions, timing marks, even emotional annotations like "more aggressive here" or "subtle vibrato." He approached music like a scientist approaching an experiment, eliminating variables, controlling outcomes. The session that day was running long. Beck was re-recording the same solo for the fourth time, not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't perfect enough. The band, Ron Wood on bass, Mickey Waller on drums, sat waiting while Beck analyzed each note through the control room monitors. Wood exchanged glances with Waller. They'd been through this routine before. Beck would play something remarkable, then dissect it until it felt sterile. Wood respected Beck's skill, but sometimes wondered if they were making music or performing surgery. "The bend on the seventh bar needs to be sharper," Beck told producer Mickey Most, "and I think the vibrato in the ninth measure could be more controlled." Most nodded, though privately he wondered if Beck was missing something. The solo was already remarkable, technically flawless, but it felt cold somehow, calculated. That's when Jimmy walked in. Chaz Chandler had brought him by. The Jimi Hendrix Experience had just finished recording Electric Ladyland, and they were looking for somewhere quiet to rehearse a few new songs. Abbey Road had an open room, and Chandler thought it might be nice for Jimmy to see how other artists worked. Even entering the room, Jimmy moved differently than other guitarists. There was something fluid about him, like he was hearing music in the air that others couldn't detect. He carried his guitar case casually, almost carelessly, in stark contrast to Beck's methodical approach to his equipment. Beck didn't know Jimmy personally, though he'd heard the stories. Everyone in London's music scene had heard the stories. The American who played guitar with his teeth, who set instruments on fire, who made sounds no one had heard before. Beck had always been dismissive. Showmanship, he'd say, gimmicks to cover up lack of real technique. But seeing Jimmy in person was different. The man didn't look like a showman. He looked curious, almost shy. His eyes moved around the studio, taking in details. The microphone placement, the amp settings, the way Beck held his guitar. "Jeff Beck," Chandler said, making introductions. "This is Jimi Hendrix." "I know who he is," Beck said, not unkindly, but not particularly warm either. He was focused on his work, on getting that solo exactly right. Jimmy nodded quietly. He was wearing a military-style jacket over a colorful shirt, his hair a perfect afro. He looked around the studio with genuine curiosity, studying the equipment, the setup, the way Beck had his guitar positioned. "What are you working on?" Jimmy asked. "A solo," Beck said, "trying to get it perfect." "Perfect?" Jimi said it like he was tasting an unfamiliar word. Beck played the solo again. It was objectively remarkable. Every note in tune, every phrase shaped with mathematical precision. The timing was flawless. The execution was beyond criticism. "That's incredible," Jimi said, and he meant it. Really clean. But Beck heard something in his tone. Not criticism exactly, but not complete admiration either. "Clean is what matters, Renosh," Beck said. "Anyone can be loud and messy. The real test is playing something perfectly. Every note exactly where it should be." Jimi didn't respond immediately. He was listening to the playback, his head tilted slightly, like he was hearing something the others weren't. "Mind if I try something?" Jimi asked. Beck almost said no. This was his session, his song, his carefully crafted solo. But something about Jimmy's quiet demeanor made him curious. "Try what?" "Playing that same part, but different." Beck handed him the guitar, a Stratocaster not unlike Jimmy's own. Jimi plugged in, adjusted the amp settings slightly, just slightly, and then positioned his hands on the fretboard. "Same chord progression?" Jimi asked. "Same chord progression," Beck confirmed. What happened next lasted exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds. Mickey Most would later time it precisely because he knew, even as it was happening, that he was witnessing something significant. Jimi started with the same notes Beck had been playing, but where Beck's version was precise and calculated, Jimmy's was organic, breathing. The notes were the same, but they seemed to have space between them. Room to resonate, room to mean something. His touch on the strings was different, lighter, but somehow more connected. Beck had always believed that control meant applying consistent pressure, maintaining steady contact. Jimmy's fingers seemed to dance across the fretboard, making contact only when necessary, letting the guitar breathe in the silence between notes. Then Jimi began to deviate, not with wrong notes, not with mistakes, with choices. Where Beck had played a perfect, controlled bend, Jimi bent the string just past perfect pitch and then brought it back down, creating a cry that sounded almost human. The imperfection wasn't accidental, it was intentional, like the crack in a singer's voice when they're moved by their own lyrics. Where Beck had used precise vibrato, measured and consistent, Jimi let his fingers shake naturally, making the guitar sound vulnerable, like it was feeling the music rather than executing it. Beck found himself leaning forward, studying Jimmy's technique. But there was no technique to study. Or rather, the technique was invisible, so internalized that it had become pure expression. Like watching a master craftsman who no longer thinks about his tools. He added small imperfections that weren't imperfections at all. They were moments of humanity, places where the guitar became a voice instead of an instrument. But the real revelation came when Jimi began to make actual mistakes and turn them into something beautiful. In the second minute, his finger slipped slightly on a high note. Instead of stopping, he embraced the slip, turning it into a bend that led somewhere unexpected. It created a phrase Beck never would have written, could never have planned, but it was perfect in its imperfection. In the third minute, Jimi hit a string accidentally while reaching for another note. The unwanted sound should have ruined the phrase. Instead, Jimi incorporated it, making it part of the melody, turning the accident into intention. Beck stood frozen, watching fingers that weren't following any rules he recognized create music that was more perfect than perfection. Everything Beck had learned about guitars seemed suddenly small. His charts, his careful notations, his hours of practice aimed at eliminating human error, all of it felt like he'd been learning to paint by numbers while someone else was creating the Sistine Chapel. The control room was silent. Ron Wood had stopped tuning his bass. Mickey Waller wasn't moving. Mickey Most sat behind the console with his mouth slightly open. Even the studio itself seemed to be listening differently. The same walls that had heard the Beatles create Abbey Road felt charged with something new, something unrepeatable. When Jimi finished, he handed the guitar back to Beck with a small smile. No fanfare. No acknowledgement that he'd just altered someone's entire understanding of music. "That work?" Jimi asked. Beck took the guitar but didn't plug it back in. He couldn't. What could he possibly play after that? His carefully rehearsed solo suddenly felt like a child's drawing shown to Picasso. "How did you—" Beck started, then stopped. The question was too big. How did I what? Those mistakes. You turned them into... They weren't mistakes anymore. Jimmy shrugged. Maybe they were never mistakes. Maybe they were just unexpected choices. Beck felt something shifting inside his chest. His entire approach to the guitar was built on eliminating the unexpected, controlling every variable, planning every phrase. What if he'd been wrong? I've been playing guitar for 12 years, Beck said. Every day, trying to get better, trying to be perfect. And you just... I've been playing guitar for 12 years too, Jimmy said. But I stopped trying to be perfect around year 2. Started trying to be honest instead. The room stayed quiet. Beck was processing something fundamental. His whole identity as a musician was being questioned. Not by criticism, but by example. Play it again, Beck said. The way you just played it. Can't, Jimmy said simply. It won't be the same. Some of those moments only happen once. That's when Beck understood. He'd been trying to capture lightning in a bottle to create the perfect performance that could be repeated exactly. Forever. Jimmy was suggesting that maybe lightning was only lightning because it was unpredictable. Your solo, Jimmy said, the one you've been working on, it's really good, but it sounds like you're afraid of it, like you don't trust it to be what it needs to be. Beck looked at his guitar. He'd spent hours perfecting that solo, eliminating every possible flaw, planning every possible moment, and somehow Jimmy was right. He was afraid of it, afraid it might not be perfect. How do you play without being afraid? Beck asked. Same way you talk without being afraid, Jimmy said. You don't plan every word before you say it. You just say what needs to be said. That evening after Jimmy left, Beck went back into the studio alone. He set up his gear, plugged in his guitar, and started the tape. Instead of playing his carefully rehearsed solo, he closed his eyes and played what he felt. He made mistakes. He let his fingers wander. He allowed uncertainty to become part of the music. The first few takes were disasters. Without his safety net of predetermined notes, Beck felt lost. But gradually something emerged. A different kind of control. Not control over every note, but control over the emotions behind the notes. The solo he recorded that night was different from anything he'd ever played. It had rough edges, unexpected moments, places where his technique wasn't perfect. It was also the best thing he'd ever recorded. When Truth was released later that year, critics and musicians alike noticed something different about Beck's playing. Guitar Player magazine wrote, Beck has found something between precision and passion. Rolling Stone noted, the technical master has learned to let go. It still had his technical brilliance, but now it had something else. Soul, humanity, risk. Beck himself couldn't explain the change to interviewers. How do you tell people that a 3-minute conversation with Jimi Hendrix had changed your entire philosophy about music? How do you admit that everything you thought you knew about your instrument was wrong? Years passed. Beck's playing continued to evolve, becoming more adventurous, more willing to embrace the unexpected. His later albums showed a guitarist who was no longer afraid of imperfection. In 1975, 7 years later, Beck was interviewed by Guitar Player magazine. The interviewer asked about the change in his style, the moment when his playing became more expressive. There was a day at Abbey Road, Beck said, choosing his words carefully. I was recording a solo, trying to make it perfect, every note exactly right, and someone came in and played the same piece but different. Different how? Different like the difference between reading a speech and having a conversation. The notes were the same, but the meaning was completely different. It taught me that perfection and truth aren't the same thing. Who was it? Beck paused. Someone who understood that the guitar is supposed to be a voice, not a computer. The interviewer pressed for details, but Beck wouldn't elaborate. Some lessons he felt were too personal to share completely, but privately Beck would sometimes think about that day, about Jimmy's quiet presence in the studio, about 3 minutes that had changed everything he thought he knew about playing guitar. Jimmy had died in 1970, 5 years earlier. Beck had gone to the funeral, standing in the back saying nothing. What could you say about someone who had taught you to stop being afraid of your own instrument? After the funeral, Beck had driven to a music store and bought a Stratocaster. Not because he needed another guitar, but because he wanted something that would remind him of that lesson. something that would make him think twice before trying to perfect the life out of a piece of music. He still had that Stratocaster in 1975. He played it on recordings where he wanted to remember to be human instead of perfect. The irony wasn't lost on Beck. In trying to be perfect, he'd been imperfect. In accepting imperfection, he'd found something closer to truth. The irony wasn't lost on Beck. In trying to be perfect, he'd been imperfect. In accepting imperfection, he'd found something closer to truth. But the lesson went deeper than technique. Beck began to understand that perfection, as he'd pursued it, was actually a form of fear. Fear of being vulnerable. Fear of being human. Fear of letting the music say something he hadn't planned for it to say. Jimi had played without fear. Not fearlessly. Beck could hear the vulnerability in every note, but without the fear of being wrong. There's a difference. That March day in 1968, Jeff Beck had been recording a solo. He thought he was trying to make it better. What he was actually doing was making it smaller, making it safe, making it predictable. Jimi Hendrix had walked into Abbey Road and, without saying much, shown Beck that the best music lives in the spaces between perfect and broken, in the places where technique serves emotion instead of the other way around. 3 minutes. That's all it took. Beck would play guitar for another 40 years after that day. He would win Grammy Awards, be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, be called one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived. But he always remembered that the greatest lesson he ever learned about guitar came from watching someone play the same notes he'd been playing, but with completely different intentions. And sometimes, late at night in his home studio, Beck would play that old solo from Truth, the one he recorded after Jimi left, the one that wasn't perfect, the one that was true. Perfect technique, Beck learned, isn't about playing every note right. It's about playing every note like it matters, like it's the only chance you'll ever get to say what needs to be said. Jimi had understood that, and for 3 minutes in a recording studio in London, he'd helped Jeff Beck understand it too. The guitar doesn't remember your mistakes. It only remembers whether you meant what you played.